You
If
know
a
that,
tree
right?
falls in the forest.
Yeah. Okay. We're recording. All right. Very good. Okay, so um, this is the 11th session of Shadow, and it's actually 11/11, and it's the 11th session. What about that? That's pretty cool. It's also Veterans Day. A lot of things going on today. So we're on page 30. You said 32, Frank?
Yeah.
That's what
Oh
I
yeah,
marked.
32.
33, yeah, 30. Is it 32?
Yeah, we're gonna start in that second full paragraph there. But we're talking, if you go one page back, and you can see the shadow and projection. So that's what we've been talking about here. You know, what happens to the left side of the balance if one doesn't keep it conscious, give it honorable expression? Well, he's positing here that we project it onto others. And that's the easiest way for us to deal with our shadow, is simply project it. So the parts of ourselves that we are not acknowledging, we see them in somebody else, or we project it onto somebody else, and we deal with them instead of dealing with our shadow. And that has lots of problems associated with it, as you can imagine. He does say that whole businesses are devoted to containing the shadow for us: movie, fashion, novels, and so on and so forth. We talked about that last week, that the reason that that doesn't work, even indulging in our guilty pleasures, is because it doesn't contain action. You know, there's something that we need to do, even if it's ritual, because the subconscious doesn't know the difference between a real act and a ritual act. But there needs to be something that we do. That's what pays out the shadow, rather than just watching somebody else do it, you know. But it does at least assuage that part of us, I suppose, but it's not really bringing it. We're not owning it unless we're doing it ourselves, is I think what Mr. Johnson would tell us, Dr. Johnson would tell us. So continuing from there, we're gonna talk about more of this projection of shadow. Before we jump into the text, is there anything anyone wants to bring up? Question, comment, concern? Okay. I think you're on, Frank.
It's a dark page in human history when people make others bear their shadow for them. Men lay their shadows upon women, whites upon blacks, Catholics upon Protestants, capitalists upon communists, Muslims upon Hindus. Neighborhoods will make one family the scapegoat, and these people will bear the shadow for the entire group. Indeed, every group unconsciously designates one of its members as the black sheep and makes him or her carry the darkness for the community. This has been so from the beginning of culture. Each year, the Aztecs chose a youth and a maiden to carry the shadow and then ritually sacrifice them. The term bogeyman has an interesting origin. In old India, each community chose a man to be the bogey. He was to be slaughtered at the end of the year and to take the evil deeds of the community with him. The people were so grateful for this service that until his death, the bogey was not required to do any work and could have anything he wanted. He was treated as a representative of the next world. Since he had the power of the collective shadow in him, he was supremely powerful and feared. From India through the West, we still have the threat: the bogeyman will get you if you're not good. This is how we frighten a child into goodness with the dark side of life. Our Old Testament has many examples of sacrifice as a device for expelling the shadow, the sins, of a people. It might be argued that ancient and medieval man could cope with his shadow by projecting it onto an enemy, but modern man cannot continue this dangerous process. The evolution of consciousness requires us to integrate the shadow if we are to produce a new age.
Okay, so you're probably thinking, as you're reading this, about examples of this type of projection, right? In your, either biblically or in other ways. Maybe you have a black sheep in your family. Maybe you are the black sheep in your family, you know, and you know what that feels like, and you know what that kind of ostracization feels like. Obviously, in the Bible, there's lots of examples of this. The easiest one is the scapegoat. I don't know if some of you, are all of you familiar with the scapegoat in Old Testament?
No.
Okay, so this was a ritual that was performed by the people in Old Testament times. And what they would do is they would take a goat and they would ritually heap the sins of the people on the goat. I mean, it's kind of just like the bogeyman here. And then the goat would be driven outside the walls of the city into the wilderness to die. And so it was expelled from the city, but it took the sins with them, with it. And so the people were then cleansed through this ritual practice. If you think about it, the temple, the purity rites of the temple and the temple system were another way of doing the same thing. If you broke the law, if you became unclean in any way, and this had, you know, I mean, if you read Leviticus, it's just about anything could make you unclean. If you touched a corpse, you were unclean. If you were a woman and you menstruated, you were unclean. If you broke the law, of course, in any way, you were unclean. If you touched a leper touched you, you're unclean. If you even touched a person who was ritually unclean or stood outside the law, you were unclean. And then there was a practice, there was a ritual that you needed to go through in order to cleanse yourself. Of course, if you had caught a skin disease or something, because everything fell under leprosy, it could be anything, not Hansen's disease as we understand leprosy. Then you would have to be cleansed of it, present yourself to the temple priest, and if they declared you clean, then you could come back into community. But until then, you were outside the community. You couldn't buy or sell or do any kind of commerce or really live within the community walls. You were outside the camp, as we were talking about on Sunday, but not in a good way. And so all of these things, these purity rites were ways for people to get back into community. So in a way, even though they sound so unfair or draconian to us, it was a way for people to come back into community. So if you had sinned, quote unquote, if you had broken the law, there was a mechanism for you to come back into community, because until that time, you were outside. But if you think about it, it's a way of paying out that shadow, right? Now think about Catholic confession. Yeah, so that's something that I was thinking about and making this connection. You know, we had that in Catholicism, and they still do, but it was a ritual way to be able to come back. I mean, it was purely symbolic. I mean, we thought about it literally. You just go in, you reel off a list of sins, and then you go kneel at the communion rail and say a few prayers, and then everything's cool. But it's a way of paying this out. And so I think that's something that we have lost by moving away from the rituals of the Catholic Church. Now, in a more important way, it's kind of like the fifth step of the 12 steps, to be able to actually talk to another human being, to relate to them. You know, it was done so ritually and so formulaically, at least in my experience, that it didn't have that kind of power to it. But I have heard that the Catholic Church is changing confession, calling it reconciliation now, and it's actually done more like we would do a counseling session, where the person can just go into the priest's office, they sit down and talk for a while. You know, I like that. You know, it brings some of the power back into it. But again, it's a way of paying out the shadow. Paul was huge on trying to get people to realize that they didn't need to keep going back through these legal purity rites all the time. He was saying that the sacrifice of Jesus was once and for all. It obviated, you know, eliminated the need for all these other rites, so that every time you had an infraction, you didn't have to go running back to the temple anymore. You know, you just needed to come back into the connection with Jesus and his sacrifice. And so thought of that way, then Jesus' sacrifice on the cross is kind of the ultimate bogeyman, I suppose. You know, he actually became sin, is the way that it's put in the New Testament. And so you talk about heaping sins on someone and having it expiated. And so Jesus is that ultimate. And then, you know, that begs the question of the actual meaning of the cross. But these are all examples in our tradition, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, of this kind of thing playing out. He's giving us a few other traditions here as well. But you could probably think of some others maybe, or have seen it playing out in your own, in a neighborhood or a family setting? Anybody? Other examples of this?
I wasn't thinking of an example of how the shadow is paid out, but I was thinking about, I remember watching a movie a couple of years ago called Dangerous Beauty. And like the main point in the movie was that this woman was so beautiful. Man fell in love with her and he couldn't control himself. So he accused her of bewitching him. And and I remember basically he filed charges against her for bewitching him. And it was a perfect example of what he's talking about with the shadow projecting, men projecting the shadow onto women.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I can't think of an example of how it's paid out off the top of my head.
Yeah,
But
so
that's
Dave,
good. That's a projection example. So that's really good too. Yeah. Kathy?
so I'm having a similar, I think I'm having a similar reaction to the earlier part that Frank just read about. It's a dark page in human history, you know, men against women, whites against blacks, Catholics against Protestants. So, I mean, I don't look at those circumstances as where the black people are volunteering to be sacrificial lambs in this situation. I mean, the whites are casting whatever shadows they are not dealing with or not managing well onto this other race. I mean, I can think of, you know, you look at the Germans and the Jews. I mean, that's got to be a whole nother casting of something onto a whole culture of people. So that to me is different than having a ritual that says, I'm going to have a confessional ritual that will cleanse me back to ground zero kind of a thing. So that's so are these, the ones they're talking about with the dark pages in history, are they saying those are shadows that are unhealthy, that are not dealt with in a proper way of, you know, they're not aware of their shadows, so therefore they're casting it on to these other cultures and people? I assume that's what he's trying to say here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. We have kind of a mixed two things here. That, for instance, the scapegoat is a projection, but it's also a ritual. And so first thing is you project all of your shadow onto the goat, you know, or onto the bogeyman or whatever it's to be. But then there's a ritual for then expiating it. Now, I guess an argument can be made, is that really active enough for us to really own our shadow? It may be just a projection. So in terms of the community can continue on and a person can come back into community, but has it really done any of their interior work? You know, I don't know about that. You know, that's you could be right here, Kathy, that it's not really going to do the trick any more than watching horror flicks is going to do the trick, even though it does release pressure. I mean, at least it can do that for you.
Sure.
But in terms of owning your shadow and bringing it in, maybe not so much. But in the other examples you're talking about, I mean, where it's just pure prejudice and ostracization of another group because you projected the shadow the way the Nazis did onto the Jews, that's a different animal altogether. And then what we're brought up too is interesting, because when you think of all the witch trials, and not just the ones from Salem in this country, but the ones that were done in medieval Europe, I mean, and he brings this up as well, that Western Christianity had completely eliminated the feminine in any sense of divinity, in any sense of exploring or owning that energy, you know, the feminine energy. And so they were literally killing it off wherever it came up in women who were strong women who you know, had their own sense of themselves. I mean, they were called witches, but what were they really doing? You know, they were just standing up to male dominance in some way or shape or form. And so that had to be killed off in a ritual sort of way as well. And so again, that shadow is that part of us that is repressed is then looked at, projected, and then banished in some way, shape, or form.
What about in evangelicalism? You know, I remember, and I don't know if many of you were around with the Toronto Blessing, you know, and you go out there and they're casting spirits out and saying, oh, in Jesus' name, you know, I come against the spirit of whatever, and they're doing the casting. And as we look at it in this context, I'm like, who's projecting what? You know what I'm saying? That seemed like it could be a mixed bag. You know, because you're just being prayed over, or we're praying over somebody, and then, you know, spirit of whatever, or a demon, or, you know, they'd be casting those things out. Is that part of it?
I'm sure.
Dave, am I making you uncomfortable?
No. I'm literally not sure about that, because, you know, I mean, who are they really casting out? Well, it's the demons. I guess maybe we can be projecting all of our stuff onto the demons. You know, as you were talking, I was thinking one clear place where the evangelicals, project their shadow is on contemplative spirituality itself. Look at the animus against contemplative spirituality. Now, that's something that's been repressed in the West on the Protestant branch for 500 years. They haven't owned that mystical contemplative part of themselves corporately or individually since the Reformation. And so now it's this horrible occult thing. Of course, you know, we're talking to the occult. And yet, on the other hand, those same practices are embraced when they are called prophecy and when they are called words of knowledge. But really, it's the same thing, you know, and it's just the label that's put on it, either Christian or from a different tradition. You know, I'm not really sure, you know. I guess, you know, in the sense that we're projecting shadow, I suppose it is. Is there anything healthy about that type of charismatic Christianity? You know, I suppose you could say that there are healthy things that come from it, but it also was rife with a lot of abuse when I was myself. So, you know, but then so are a lot of other things. Mm-hmm. That's an interesting question. I have to think about that a little bit more. But I think the most important thing is for us to, as we're thinking about this, is to apply it to things that are actually in our experience and in our lives, and not have it be out there always someplace else, because that's the way it's going to be able to really work for us in terms of, like William was talking about the Enneagram. It's a self-awareness tool. Well, I look at this as another self-awareness tool, but it has to actually apply to the things that we're going through in our lives. Otherwise, it's always going to be out there someplace, and it's not going to be really a point where we need to actually take any sort of action, or can take any sort of action. Yeah. I can talk about the Salem witch trials all day long, but it's never really going to attach itself to me in any real way, you know. But we can take that and say, well, how are women being marginalized now, today, in some place that is close to me? And is that a part of the same thing? No.
I don't know if this counts, Dave, but I was thinking about my mother always tells the story when she was growing up. You know, she's almost 90 now, and she said, you know, in her family, it was just, well, I don't know if this really makes sense or not. I mean, the women were looked at as they were just to get married, and you know, all my mom wanted to do was to go to school and to excel and go on into school and things, but none of the girls were even thought about or would even have that opportunity to go to school. It was only the boys. So I don't even know if that was like a ritual, but it was just sort of like a cultural understanding that maybe, you know, this is where we're going to put the investment over here, but not over here on this side of the family. So, I mean, I'm just trying to think of differences in terms of like black sheep. I don't think they were seen as black sheep of the family. It's just that they were girls, and it was just automatic that they were not going to go to college, but the boys were. So I don't know if that makes any sense or if it even relates.
I think it absolutely does. I mean, if you think about it, what his first, you know, sort of, you know, concept here was that culture shapes those parts of our full persona that we can project and those that we have to repress. And so if it's a highly patriarchal society, then the feminine is not going to be honored in that culture, you know, at least not in the marketplace as much, you know, yes, in child rearing and those sorts of things, but it's going to be repressed. And so we need to all repress it, male or female. We're going to be repressed that because that's what the culture is teaching us, or at least that's what the household, you know, in this case, you're saying, yeah, it was the parents who had, Marion had the same thing happening to her. She has, you know, she had first generation German Yugoslavian parents, and that old country culture was the same way. You know, they wanted a boy, you know, and they got two girls first. And so, you know, and Marion always said, you know, she was the girl who was supposed to be a boy. So she was kind of flyover country until they got the boy. And so, and for her, it was just like, yeah, there was no consideration that she needed to really get educated or anything. She just needed to marry well, you know. We can say that she finally did that. That's but
Jury's still out on that.
She married up.
it certainly didn't help her out financially, I can tell you that.
Well, and just to be, you know, just to finish that piece, was my grandparents were very loving people. There was no abuse or anything like that in the household. It was just like this sort of unspoken understanding that the girls would not get that consideration, but the boys would. So it was just sort of understood. You know, it wasn't like they were putting them down necessarily, or, you know, demonizing the women. It just was that way. So it was just kind of interesting.
But look what that does to the girls. You know,
Yeah.
so now the shadow content is not negative content. It's their gold, right? As he puts it. You know, Marion still regrets that she didn't go to college, but it wasn't valued in her home. You know, and when she got a really good job that made really good money back in the day, out of high school, her parents celebrated that. That's what they valued, not something that would have a longer term, you know, learning curve to it, and a career maybe that she would have valued more eventually. And so she stuck with what was valued, what gave her the approval. And so, I think these are the kind of things that he's talking about here. You know, what gets repressed is sometimes it's the better angels, you know, not the bad stuff. It's just what that household values.
Hey, what about those purity rings in the church? You know, that the girls were supposed to wear. I don't know if there was an equal thing with the guys.
Oh, was that so that there was no sex before marriage? That sort of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, that's happening with males too, not just females.
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That whole idea that you're gonna save yourself, but I think it's probably, you know, was weighted toward women more than men anyway, and that's part of, again, it's part of our patriarchal culture. You know? So yeah, I think that definitely can be. You know, we can probably come up with endless examples, but I think the examples that are going to be powerful are the ones that really speak to what we are experiencing in our lives. It's got to have some relevance to it, and then we can see, how does that apply to us, our shadow? What is it that we repressed? And what is it that's coming out sideways? You know, to the extent that we're experiencing a lot of anxiety and depression and stress, which is what I keep hearing over and over and over again with the people I'm counseling, you know, and it's coming from a lot of different sources, but it's playing out in much the same way. If that's happening in our life, then we can say, okay, you know, the shadow's coming out sideways because we're not finding a way to balance it. And so what can we do? How can we do that self-awareness, use the self-awareness tool to figure out what is it that we are not balancing, and how can we start to pay that out, either ritually or for real. And I suppose we're going to use the ritual for those parts of our psyche that really do need to be repressed in polite culture, you know, the things that shouldn't be just vented on people, but the good stuff, that needs to be real. We need to bring that out. This gets back to following your bliss, I think. So many people are not following their bliss. They don't even know what their bliss is. They haven't explored that part of themselves yet. It was pushed down so early and for so long. Either they don't remember that they used to love certain things. You know, I'll ask people, what did you love to do when you were 8 years old? Can you remember what you loved to do when you're 8 years? Are you still doing it now in any way, shape, or form? You know, well, maybe you can't do exactly that, but maybe you can do something that has some of those similar components, and you'll find out, yeah, it's still your voice. And that would be bringing something up that has been repressed because the circumstances have changed. No one is repressing that anymore except you, right? And the program that was put in place early on.
Well, I used to like throwing rocks through windows, so I should start doing that again, Dave?
That's the part that's got to be a ritual there, Frank. How will
Don't
you,
live in glass houses, Frank.
Yeah.
Start
Long
with your
as-
own house, Frank.
Yeah, as long as they're your own windows.
how can Frank ritually throw rocks at windows? Pay that shadow out. Yeah, you figured that out.
My parents or my family probably say that's why I'm such a butthead. I'm always a little slightly ornery.
So yeah, you've actually told us
Maybe
a
in some way
you were the black sheep of your family to a certain extent, right, Frank?
Yeah.
I mean, you told us those kind of stories. So
Yeah.
I'm sorry,
Not
Kathy.
just kidding about the throwing the rocks. I didn't do that as a kid.
All right.
I was not a destructive child.
Okay. Kathy, cut you off. What were you saying?
No, I was just saying to Frank, I said, well, maybe you were stirring the pot then by throwing rocks, and you're still stirring the pot today. So you've progressed.
Yeah, there you go.
You found your bliss, Frank. You just keep stirring that pot, buddy.
That's fine.
All right. Let's read a little bit more. Where do we leave off? Top of 34? Yeah, top of
Yes.
34.
This is an awesome subject, yet the shadow often shows itself in petty and mundane ways. I had a friend whose father was a retired Cambridge professor. The family dog, old and difficult, had to be put in a kennel each winter. Yet when it was brought home again each spring, the whole household brightened. The old man now kicked the dog instead of taking his shadow out on the other family members. It's not uncommon for people to keep a pet to carry their dark side.
Oh, that's terrible.
Awful.
Oh,
It's funny when I was reading this paragraph for the first time, and he said the whole household brightened each spring. When the dog came home, I thought, oh, how sweet. Until I read the next sentence and figured
Yeah.
they brightened because they weren't getting the old man's wrath anymore. It was being projected downstream in a different way. And I suppose that, he says it's not uncommon for people to do such a thing, to carry their dark side. I don't know.
Well,
Yep.
Dave, can I
Go ahead.
just offer a really silly, quick, funny story?
Sure.
My dad was, when he was alive, Sharon knows him a little bit from the old days, but he was a very outspoken, kind of a mouthy Bronx, New Yorker kind of a guy, my dad. Very opinionated, and he kind of would cast his wrath around the family, here and there. And so when we had family dinners, it was always a torture. Who was going to sit next to Dad? So when we had new people come and we had visitors, we'd always say, sit here, please, sit next to my dad. We always said, that person's going to get the wrath. And, well, what do you do for a living? Well, what are you doing that for? They just get to So that was kind of like, okay, he's taking the wrath out on them and we're off the hook tonight. So.
Not a lot of second-time visitors, eh?
A few of them are brave enough to come back. So.
Oh, that's funny. But that's real typical. And just to tat a little bit on Marion's family, she said growing up, her father was the hard one and her mother was softer. But now that they're older, it's switching. And her father is getting more and more irascible, kind of like what you're talking about, Kathy, with your dad. And of course, I haven't seen them now for quite some time because of COVID. But the last few times I was out there, he's getting curmudgeonly. He's getting real crotchety and irascible. And it was just interesting to see that starting to play out in him. Now, what's that all about? Well, he's getting older. He's seen the end of life coming. I don't know, maybe some of the filters that were in place to keep the shadow down are leaking. But I just was noticing it's been a real change in him. And in this context, it's kind of interesting how that can work out and play out. Okay, a little bit more, Frank.
Probably the worst damage is done when parents lay their shadow on their children. This is so common that most people have to work very hard to throw off their parent's shadow before they can begin their own adult lives. If a parent lays his shadow on a young child, that splits the personality of the child and sets the ego-shadow warfare into motion. When that child grows up, he will have a large shadow to cope with, more than just the cultural shadow that all of us carry. And he will also have the tendency to put that shadow upon his own children. The Bible tells us that the sins of a man shall be visited unto the third and fourth generation. If
So,
you wish to,
hold on a second. So how does that happen? Okay, so it's common that most people have to work real hard to throw off their parent's shadow. Parent lays shadow on a young child, splits personality. When that child grows up, have a large shadow to cope with, more than just the cultural shadow all of us carry, and have a tendency to put that shadow on his own children. Can you think of ways that that happens? How do parents put their shadow on their children? How did your parents put their shadow on you? Is probably the more pertinent question. How does that happen? Have you seen that happen? Has it happened to you? You know, we were just talking about this a couple of Sundays ago. We were talking about that continuum concept. And if you grew up in a household with parents that were impossible to please, you know, you end up on a continuum between non-acceptance and acceptance. And you're always working to cross that magic line somewhere unknown to you and apparently to your parents as well. When are you finally acceptable? When have I done enough so that I'm acceptable? But no matter what you did, it seemed like you couldn't please them. And so you put these programs in place, you know, what Thomas Keating would call programs for happiness, programs for survival. And of course, when the circumstances change, they don't go away. And so you're still on that continuum. You're still on that hamster wheel. Can you come up with some ideas of how parents do this? How do they lay their shadow on the kids?
I would imagine that any form of abuse would be an expression of that,
Okay.
because the child has to, and I think the splitting he is referring to here, or at least what I thought about, was the child has to love the abusive parent. So the child is dependent on this parent to take care of them. And at the same time, this parent is causing them harm. And the child has to split those two parts of themselves, essentially, to manage. So that's the first thing I thought of. But I also thought of an example of a friend I had in undergrad who was, you know, this heavyset guy who, you know, was pursuing his degree in accounting and things of that nature. And after his mom died, he came out of the closet probably within a couple of months afterwards, switched from accounting to a field that he enjoyed. And it was later revealed that he got into accounting because his mom wanted him to, and like he kept that homosexual part of himself a secret because his mom had a whole host of expectations for him. And I remember us talking about, you know, he loved his mom obviously and cherished her, but there was a sense of relief when she passed, and he was feeling guilty about that relief. So I lost my train of thought there, but hopefully some of that makes sense.
No, I thought that's a great example of it. So what was valued by the parent has to be valued by the child in order for the child, again, that sense of loyalty that the child has. This is how I love my parent back. You know, this is how I get approval back. And so have to repress the things. And so when he talks about splitting the personality, the child, when the child is young enough, it's whole, right? It's all the personality is there and it just comes out. They don't know they're naked. It just all comes out. Then they start getting punished for the things that the parent does not approve of, you know, and then sometimes rewarded, but maybe not even rewarded for the things they do approve of. But at least it's been communicated to them the things that the parent approves of, whether they can ever please the parent or not. And so now they have to split. They have to take what was once whole, and part of it has to be shadowized, and then the other is projected. And so that also splits. And yeah.
I remember when my mom was very difficult to please, and you did want to please her at all costs. But we would get into trouble, and what you would often hear her say was, you know, because I tended to have a very smart mouth that would get me in trouble a lot.
No, say that.
I know that shouts you all very much, but she would very forcefully and venomously say, you don't have to love me, but you will respect me. And that came down very firmly. So, you know, it was not a demand for love, but it was an absolute for respect. So that was a real kind of jarring on the inside of this need of that I was supposed to respect when I completely didn't respect, and I could see these very backwards behaviors out of this person who was supposed to be caring for me. You know, incongruous actions that did not add up at all. And I would hear that over and over and over when my mom got mad, this demand for respect. And those things, you know, it was very difficult. And whether I would get praised for doing things right or disciplined for doing things wrong, it really tweaks with your brain. So I can definitely say I experienced a lot of that confusion that happens in a child.
So can you identify the things that you had to repress, hide away from your mom that maybe now are coming back as an adult?
Well, my mom just passed, so not yet. A lot of well, no, it's not clear yet.
Okay.
Honestly.
Okay. So, for instance, your art, was that something that you have been doing ever since you were a child?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So that wasn't repressed. You weren't disallowed from doing that or discouraged from doing that?
I was actually discouraged. I wanted to go into art as a profession. She said, you will not be a starving artist, so she would not let me go to school.
Okay.
In art. But, you know, now since I've done it for years, she always said how she was my biggest fan, and, you know, she was always behind me, and I'm like going, right, let me just choke over here on the side of the road that you always supported me. Right, Mom. But, you know, whatever on that, because if she had of, I would have had a degree and been involved in art all the time. So that was something I did, you know, in spite of her, that I ended up still in an art field. But no, that was definitely not to spite her. It was just because, you know, it was part of my blood. It just was who I was. But definitely she was not for me doing that.
I am struck by Sharon's comment there. I often have the experience with my mom. She remembers things very differently than the way they played out. And I wonder if that's an extension of the shadow being repressed in her. Like she, like all the kids remember it one way and she remembers a completely different way. Yeah, I'll leave that one alone, actually.
Yeah.
Uh,
So, yeah, any form of abuse obviously is a laying of shadow upon the children, whether it's verbal, whether it's physical, whether it's sexual. But I think there's other things that we can look at too that sometimes can be looked at least initially as positive. You know, this idea of helicopter parents, you know, that I've just been hearing that term more recently, but the idea of a parent that hovers over their children, kind of micromanages them, but involved in everything that they do. And, you know, I guess to a certain level that could be seen as positive, as a very attentive parent. But, you know, what's really going on there? And what is it about the excessive need to control that is now being laid on the children and stifling them in ways that you can imagine? Or what about the parent that really pushes the child hard? You know,
mhm.
and to an extent, they're really kind of living vicariously through their child. There's things that they didn't follow through on in their own life or weren't able to accomplish in their own life, and now they're doing it through their child. And they're laying that on the child as well. And now that pressure to perform, that pressure to be the certain thing, you know, the stage mom kind of stereotype, that sort of thing. I think that would be another way that parents lay their shadow upon the child. Whatever it is that was repressed, you know, is coming through. Whether it was a positive thing or a negative thing, when it's laid on somebody else and projected onto them, it becomes a burden for them to have to carry.
I think of the movie Dead Poet Society that comes to mind, with the son that's in the military school or boarding school, and he wants to become an actor, and his dad says, you will become a doctor, you will go to medical school, just like your father and your grandfather and all this. And he's forced, and it doesn't have a happy ending, unfortunately. So
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of a stock. I just saw the movie again, which I always liked, called October Sky. Have any of you seen that one? It was about the 50s and these young kids who were sending up rockets and learning rocket science. And the one main character, his father was a coal miner and the son of a coal miner, and they lived in coal country. And, you know, the pressure for him to go down into the mines was huge, and what he had to do to stay on point and continue to make his rockets, and then eventually ended up working for NASA. It was a true story that they put in the movie. But that same sort of idea, yeah, all that pressure because it's the shadow of the parent. So we all grew up, there are no perfect parents. We all put our shadow on our kids. There's no way that we can't, you know, especially at the age that we're typically parenting earlier on, when we haven't got our act together. That's why grandparents, you know, can be much more even-handed with their grandchildren than parents were. And why Bill Cosby said, these aren't the people who raised me, you know? It's like, yeah, they grew up. Well, glad that they did, you know? But so everybody gets the shadow laid on them. And to a certain extent, it's the way it's supposed to be. Because if there isn't any pain in childhood, then we're never going to want to leave it. It is the pain of childhood, the wounding, that kicks us into the world of the adult. And so within limits, it's the way it's supposed to be. But if we could keep it to a minimum, and this is what Frank is going to read right now. Go ahead and continue, Frank.
If you wish to give your children the best possible gift, the best possible entree into life, remove your shadow from them. To give them a clean heritage, psychologically speaking, is the greatest legacy. And incidentally, you will go far in your own development by taking your shadow back into your private psychological structure, where it first originated and where it is required for your own wholeness. Dr. Jung told a man who came to analysis complaining that he never dreamed. He went on to say that his 5-year-old son had the most vivid dreams. Jung took the son's dreams as the unlived shadow of the father and viewed them as part of the man's own psychology. After a month of this, the father began dreaming on his own, and the son's vivid dreaming ceased. By now, Jung's patient had taken up his own burdens, instead of unconsciously leaving them for his child to bear.
Okay,
Wow.
so take a look at this one. How in the world is this possible? Okay, why would the son be dreaming the father's unlived dream? Okay, we're starting to sound a little bit supernatural here. You know?
Yeah.
What's going on, do you think? How, if this is accurate, if this really is a description of what Johnson and Jung are talking about, what was going on here? Why was the son dreaming what he was dreaming?
Well, I would imagine the son was hearing stories from the father saying, gee, if it wasn't for, you, maybe I would be here or there. If I didn't marry your mother, oh, this is where I would be. And I guess hearing that enough, I can understand where a child would be processing that and saying, gee, maybe dad's wishes, he didn't have me. Now all of a sudden you start having bad dreams, or you start having all these different types of dreams of, of a better life or what have you. So, I mean, I can see where something like that might happen.
And I'm in complete agreement with you. That's what I was thinking too. Some way, shape, or form, the father was transmitting his desires, his frustrations, his unlived fantasies. Either if it was negative, kind of the way Frank you were bringing it up, or whether it was positive.
Yeah.
In some way or shape or form, he was laying all this stuff on the kid, creating all of these images in his waking state that were then being played out in the dream state. I mean, it would have to be something like that, to be transmitted, unless we're going to go into the woo-woo place and it's just, somehow telepathically or somehow. But that's what I would imagine. And then once the father stopped doing that, once he owned that part of himself, then the son was free to dream his own dreams and the intensity of dreams that he was supposed to be. And then if the father understands that that's his unlived part of life, then he can start following his own bliss and putting things in place, that are possible to put in now that he's got a family and so on and so forth. But things start to get right-sized again. That makes sense to everybody?
Yep.
Anyone have another thought on that? You nailed it, Frank.
Thank you.
Wow, look at that. I think.
Well, miracles never cease.
I was thinking about some of the attachment research that was done where they recorded interactions between parents and children. And they had these micro expressions, like a grimace or something like that, that might show up on the mom's face, and she is not aware of it. And if you're looking at it in real time, you won't see it. You might miss it. But if you're recording it and you're looking at the actual frames, you see this consistent grimace or this kind of almost like an evil face or something like that might show up in response to a little annoyance that the kid is committing or something like that. And when they interview the moms, typically they're not aware that it was even there. But it was directly correlated to the quality of attachment the kid had to their parents, whether it was a secure attachment or a disorganized attachment and so on. And it's just amazing how that could be transmitted unconsciously, where the kid might not even be fully aware of it, but the impact is there.
That's fascinating. That is, well, it's like subliminal programming then. When they put those frames into the commercial or something, and it's too quick for the eye to even actually register, but the brain does. The same sort of thing is that's interesting. So much can be transmitted that way when you think about it. I mean, so much of the whole shadow thing can be transmitted without even a word consciously spoken. Wow, that's interesting.
Scary.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I'm always telling people, if you're feeling it, you're telegraphing it. Just know that, in some way. And even if you think you have the best interface, there's always a tell someplace, right? And maybe what you're talking about, William, is kind of those little micro tells that are still being picked up by people. They won't even, they'll know that they're feeling something, but they won't necessarily know why that's coming off of you.
Mhm.
We've all experienced that. There's just something about that person. What is it? Well, maybe it's their subliminal programming. That's
Uh-huh.
that's really
And we see it when, for example, you might, like, I'm over at my ex-girlfriend's house and her mom does something that completely annoys her. And I'm there and I'm seeing the whole interaction and I completely miss what that something was. But she can pick up on it because it's in her programming, and whether it's just a small little inflection in a word or something like that that's rich with meaning for her, but for me it's just, wow, why are you reacting this way?
yeah. Of course, that's after the programming has occurred. But these micro expressions, that is the programming.
That is
So that's I hadn't heard of that research. That's really interesting. Very cool. All right. I think we can do let's do one more paragraph just to kind of get another example from him, and then we'll call it for the evening.
My own father took refuge in invalidism and lived very little of his potential. As a result of this, I feel I have two lives to cope with, my own and the unlived life of my father.
Okay, so that he was an invalid, right? So he was taking refuge in being an invalid, lived very little of his potential. So now we're back to the same kind of thing. As a result of this, he felt he had two lives to cope with, his own and the unlived life of my father. I was asking the question, why? Why would that have affected him if his father was living his life in a certain way? But I think we sort of answered that, didn't we? There was going to be a telegraphing to the child of the father's, frustration or displeasure or whatever it was that he was feeling in not living his potential, even though he was taking refuge and absolving himself from the responsibility of doing more with his life. But in some way, maybe it was these micro expressions, who knows, things he said, just the way he came off was throwing all of this onto the young Robert Johnson. And it's, because I'm sure it wasn't conscious, but it still happened. And that's what's so fascinating about this stuff. I mean, go ahead, Frank.
This is a severe burden, but it can have creative dimensions if I take on this task consciously.
Okay, so that's an important sentence. Okay, so the burden that he got was severe from the father, but now it can have creative dimensions if he takes it on consciously. And so the question is, well, how does that happen? If you're conscious of what has happened, then what can you do with it? What is it that can take on the creative dimensions? I know we don't have time to kick this around a lot. It may be something to think about, because we've all had stuff laid on us. But if we can take it consciously, how would it change things if we knew what it was that had been laid on us? Once again, to me, it's all about awareness. This is another tool to develop awareness. If we can become aware of the type of shadows that were laid on us, and especially with our parents, as an adult, you can look back. I know I can look back at my parents and I can see them with an adult's eyes, and I can see some of the things. I can remember things that had no meaning to me as a child that have huge meaning to me now, and I can see now more into their relationship and the kind of things that they're really eating at them from the inside out, even though they never really fought in our presence, and so on and so forth. And so looking at that with that kind of awareness can help me to dismantle some of the effects or some of the programming. And I think that's what he's talking about with the creative dimensions. So it really is about awareness and about then us being able to live to our potential. But I would say, kick that one around a little bit and put it into your own personal experience and see how some of that stuff could now be of creative use to you if you can approach it consciously. Go ahead and finish the paragraph there, Frank.
Such things are possible only when we are old enough and mature enough to know what we are doing. though we do not usually have this kind of wisdom until we reach middle age.
And the last one will finish the thought.
It is hard to overestimate the amount of suffering that is handed down from generation to generation. Harry Truman had a little sign on his desk while he was president. The buck stops here. We could give our children the most wonderful blessing if only we would stop passing the buck to them.
All right. Easier said than done. All right. Any final thoughts? Feels like we're unpacking this, don't you think?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's starting to get more and more useful as we keep banging on the door. So he's going to talk next about refusing the projection. So that'll be an interesting topic to start on next.
I'll share real fast. I actually, this has been helpful, Dave, because I've been using this, and I used it as a tool even tonight. I was talking to my ex-wife, the boy's mom, and so she's sharing with me all what she's going through with her roommate. And I won't bore you guys with all the details, but long story short, as I've been listening to her over this for the last couple of weeks now, and it dawned on me, and to keep the peace, because it's always been one of those situations that if we're going to have a relationship, it's up to me. I mean, very, very rarely is it, do I get the phone call and, hey, how's it going, Frank, or so on and so forth. The only time I get a phone call is maybe if there's a problem. But after, well, I won't even worry about that part. I'll just worry about this part. So what was happening is I'm listening to this conversation, and finally, and I'm giving her really good advice on what to do and so on and so forth. And I finally stopped. I said, you know what, Sheila? I go, let me give you some advice. I go, first off, if he starts saying some stuff to you, and he gets really upset about you wanting to get rid of him as a roommate, I said, there's nothing wrong with that. You've been a really good roommate to him. And I'll be honest with you. And I go, I really shouldn't share this, but I'm going to share it anyway. I go, I think if you would have treated me half as well as you're treating your roommate, we would be married to this today. I see how you are to him and I go, boy, you look after his kid, you buy gifts for him, you do all these different things and stuff. And I go, there would have been a time I wouldn't have told you this, but I'm going to tell you. I go, I'm a little jealous, man. I go, it's really interesting to me how I'm hearing all this stuff. And it's like, boy, if you would have just given me a little taste of that, we would be married to this day. So it was the idea that for so long, I was just holding it in, trying to keep the peace, being a good friend, being a good, and I started realizing, wait, that's a shadow. There's a part right now that I want to tell her something, and I'm not wanting to do it because it might mess up the relationship. Heck with it. I'm going to tell her what I think. I mean, it wasn't bad, but it was like, one, I'm having to be vulnerable to tell her that, boy, I wish I would have had some of that. So part of it was I didn't want to be vulnerable, but the other part of it was I didn't want her to get defensive and say, and I didn't want to hear any of that either. So it was just like, I just figured, I won't say anything. Well, finally I got enough nerve and I just said, I'm going to bring it up.
So it was kind of a compliment and it was kind of not.
Well, yeah, it was kind of a compliment. Well, yeah, it was. You're right. I mean, it was kind of a compliment, kind of not. But I mean, there was a lot of things playing in my head. Do I bring this up or not? Because I mean, I knew that yes, it's a backhanded compliment. I also knew that I'm being vulnerable because I'm gonna have to say, hey, look, I wish I had some of that. I'm kind of jealous, and so there was a lot of things playing in my head, and the easier play would have just said, shut up, but I thought, nah,
Well, the cool thing is that she's grown, just like Bill Cosby's parents, they grew and she's grown and she's able to relate and roommate better than she could back when. And, I think pretty much we're all doing the best we can with the tools we got to work with. It's a moving front. Hopefully it's a moving front. So that will be better, I say that I'd say the same thing about my first marriage. If I could have approached it the way I'm approaching the one I have now, you know, but I couldn't. I absolutely couldn't. I didn't have the tools. I didn't have the awareness. I had way too much fear. So couldn't have done it.
Yeah.
So, oh well, that is the way life works.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, the people that meet us, you know, early on when we're way unfinished, they get the brunt of all this junk, don't they? You know, Marion sometimes says, "Oh, I wish we would have met sooner," and it says, "I don't know if you would have liked me sooner." I don't know if that would have worked.
Yeah. Well, I've been told I'm a much better ex-husband than husband.
That's great. All right. Okay, Frank, send us home, buddy.
Father, thank you for this evening. Thank you for fun and laughter. Thank you for introspection and reconsideration. And thank you for growth, whether it comes with old age or whether it comes with learning the lessons while we're young. Thank you for the opportunity to grow and mature and change and be for the better. So show us how to best do it. Let us do it with you, hand in hand, and share it with others. And we thank you and love you and pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Yeah. Okay, Danielle. Danielle, you're tasked with letting our Arizona contingent know they missed the best conversation yet.
All right, I will. I'll send it along now.
Project a little shadow on them, please.
Oh, that's not right.
Tell them we missed them. Tell them we
Hey,
missed them.
Dave, are you sending out an email about the time change
Yes,
for next
I
week?
will.
Okay, that's in the docket then. Okay.
Today didn't work out as planned. I got stranded by my car in Santa
You
Ana.
got time. Oh, no.
I just-
Santa Ana.
Yeah, I had to go to Chalk today, and my car
Oh,
broke
God.
down, and you know, it was just one thing after another. 3.5 hours later, I finally got a loaner car and got home, but the car is still out there. I still don't know what's wrong with it, you know. But COVID, it reared its ugly head. You try to call AAA for a tow truck, and it took 20 minutes to get someone on the phone. Then they tell me I can't ride with the tow truck driver anymore because of COVID, so I had to call a cab. And it was one thing after another. It was crazy, insane.
Oh, my gosh.
But I didn't think I was going to get back here in time for this, but thank God I decided to go to the dealership rather than just an auto shop, and they were able to give me a loaner car. So now I have this brand new RAV4 that I get to drive around for a couple of
Oh, I love RAV4s.
Yeah. RAV4 is the one that's broken too. So
Ah.
we are a RAV4 family.
Mhm.
He has one, I have one. Anyway, that's enough about cars. Thanks, everybody. It was a great time tonight. See you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Good night,
Bye,
good night, everybody.
Good
Hi,
night.
Danielle.
Good night, sweetie.
Bye, Jordana. Bye.
Bye-bye, Kathy.
Good night, guys.
Good night, Scotty.
Bye.
Bye, Linda. Bye, Jordana. Bye, Sherry.
See you guys Sunday.
All right. See y'all Sunday.